All right, ready to get going here on part 2 of the Working with Color Level 1 video. So I talked about, in my last video, I talked about the color palette here, this one, the transparency palette, and the gradient palette. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to go over the differences between a tint of a color and the transparency of a color. So I'm going to make 2 copies of this square, both filled with my RGB cyan global spot color, and I'm going to adjust the transparency of this to 50%, and I'm going to adjust the tint of this one to 50%. So right off the gate you can sort of tell that, you know, I was adjusting the transparency. That applies to the entire shape. So you'll notice how it changed the tint of the stroke, which is the line around it. And your stroke here, just in case you're not familiar with the basic tool palette, is what these 2 things are here, right? So we could apply my global spot color to the stroke color for this shape. Select the shape first, of course. And, you know, the stroke is applied there. So, you know, you have to sort of, we'll get into working with shapes in a little more detail in other videos, but, you know, depending on how you use your stroke, strokes have a very specific function in Adobe Illustrator in certain applications. Of course, they can be purely aesthetic. If you just happen to want a line around your shape, that's fine. But they actually have a production purpose as well, which we'll get into in more advanced videos. But I've got these 2 colors here, so I'm just going to take the stroke off of this one. So you can see over white, tint and transparency look exactly the same. So if you don't have things layered up, you might think that they're kind of interchangeable, but they aren't. They do a different thing, because this shows through what is underneath and this doesn't. So there's a difference between why you would choose to lighten a color using the tint versus the transparency. So if you want to mix together what's in behind your color, you use your transparency. And if you don't, if you just want to lighten that color up, then you use this. As well, you can do a combination of tinting and transparency. So if I set a 50% tint of that spot to 50% opacity, I'm actually going to get a 25% effective output of this color. So you can combine them as well that way. So getting a really good solid understanding, just practicing with your tint and your transparency, is an important concept to understand in Adobe Illustrator, because we are commonly overlapping graphics, and sometimes we want stuff to show through and other times we don't. So the next thing you would notice down here is this gradient palette. You know, I want to kind of shade my colors, or shade my shapes. We could give some sense of shadow or whatever. So gradients are used all over the place. Really depends on your particular style, but you know, your default gradient here is just a black to white, and you'll see that there's 2 slider handles here. There's the, you know, one color and your other color. So that's a default gradient, just black to white. That's what you kind of see, and it won't show up here in your swatches palette yet, because you have to actually save your swatches if you want to use them. But before I get into that, I'm just going to go through the different types. So you've got your default linear gradient, radial gradient, and then this thing called a freeform gradient, which has its place, but it's basically a bunch of, you'll notice that you no longer have your points here. You now have these little kind of circles of color that you can kind of move around, and you can adjust the relative size of them within limits, and you can kind of control whether it puts lines between your colors or circles. So you can mess around with it. I think that there's better ways to build these freeform gradients personally than using this. I find these a little clunky to work with, but everybody kind of gets comfortable with themselves. But the main thing about gradients that I want to kind of cover is the way Illustrator builds them by default. If you're just doing a single fill, I'm going to zoom in a little closer here. There's this kind of muddy gray area between like reds and blues. And you know, Illustrator is doing a pretty good job of previewing how that's going to look when it goes down on paper, because this is, you can imagine this is a mix of cyan, magenta, and yellow, and maybe a little bit of black. So to get this blue, you know, it's going to be mostly cyan, and over here is going to be mostly magenta, but to fade from one to the other, it's got to mix these tints, and where those mixed tints are going to overlap, you're going to get a little bit of a gray. You're going to see some of the white paper showing through, so you just don't get as vibrant a color between there, and that is realistic in terms of how CMYK would go down on the paper. But to another degree, Illustrator is also kind of forcing the way that that ink is going to go down, and there's other ways that we can get a more intense look to it, and that will be part of what I'll call level 2 in another video. But for the basics, just getting comfortable with the 3 types of gradients, you know, and typically what you're using is really linears and radial. So over here we have what's called the gradient tool. Kind of looks like a little gradient. It's going to bring up a handle, which you can see, if I combine them right, just without touching anything, matches right there. So it's the same thing. This is just sort of this is called the ramp, and this is just moving where the point and the color kind of starts to go to ramp over. So it's kind of like a little bit of a blender. Okay. You can also change the relative size of this by clicking on this handle here. These take a little bit of practice to work with. And you can also change the aspect. And you can also, with a little bit of floating around, find it. You got to kind of move your mouse fairly carefully here to see this little rotation tool pop up, and then you can actually rotate the orientation of that shape within your of the gradient shape within your graphic that you're applying a gradient fill to. And then you can move around the center point as well, but that's always going to kind of offset, but there's definitely good reason for that. And then you can, of course, expand out that pure color so that you can get quite a few interesting effects by really practicing with the gradient shaping tool. It's much more basic on the linear. Basically, you can adjust the angle, so you click and drag, but that's pretty much all you can do. This kind of little marquee box that you see that represents like the angle or the envelope of the gradient. So when you click and drag, you can kind of stretch it. Think of it almost working like it's kind of like being masked by the shape that you're applying the fill to. Once you've got the angle how you like it, you can adjust where the white goes this way and adjust the ramp. And you can do the exact same thing here in the gradient palette. So once you've got the angle, if you're more comfortable using this, you can kind of mess around with this. Now these colors can be replaced. You can now grab, let's say we're going to stick with our RGB cyan. I'm going to replace the black with that, and it automatically replaces that. And maybe I want to go to just a tint of that exact same spot color. So it's a little bit of a subtle difference there, but when I go to a 0% tint of the spot color, that's sort of step 1 of making a slightly more pure looking gradient. Illustrator's just going to render that a little more purely versus trying to blend to a white. It's a very subtle difference though, so it's not huge, but it's a good habit to get into, is if you're going to build your gradients out of your spots, make sure that you're not blending to like a black or something. Typically we want to blend to a tint of the same spot color. Another little somewhat hidden element of the gradient palette here is the ability to save this swatch. You know, once you've got your gradient perfect, sometimes you're going to make it with quite a few colors or whatever. You don't want to have to keep building that every single time, but if you forget to save your swatch, you're going to have to come back and select the shape that has your swatch. But you do want to be able to apply it multiple times typically. And this kind of comes into more advanced rendering and stuff like that. You tend to use your gradients quite a bit. So you click this little arrow here, and then this super intuitive little icon that says add to swatches. You know, it looks kind of like this weird blank palette, but you add that to the swatches, it's now saved that as a gradient swatch. But it's also available here, so you can kind of switch between gradients. So, like, let's say I want this linear in my RGB cyan, but I also want a version of it in my RGB red. And again, I'm carefully making sure that I see the little plus icon pop up there, which is going to switch the spot. So that, you know, saves it there. So I'm going to save this now as the red version of that gradient. And then I'm going to make my RGB blue version. So actually I'm not going to skip this because you can see it a little bit. Because I'm blending to 0% of my RGB red, it's added a bit of magenta. Illustrator's added a bit of the magenta to the blend, but if I change this color to RGB blue and tint it to 0, it's more of a pure blue. It's not, it doesn't have quite as much of the red in there. It's, again, it's pretty subtle, but that is something that Illustrator's doing a little differently, kind of behind the scenes. So that's something to pay attention to. So I've saved those 3 swatches. Now in my gradient palette, I can change this way, or I can change it this way. So the gradient palette and the swatch palette sort of have some redundancy there. Because you're not necessarily always going to have all these palettes open, I would recommend keeping these palettes open when you're just getting used to working with color. Sort of if you're new to Adobe Illustrator, these are the 3 palettes, or 4 palettes actually, that you kind of want to have open. And again, you're going to see different menus up here depending on the workspace that you have. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through the workspace, but there's different workspaces. I've made my own custom workspaces just because I sort of want to remove as much as possible, so I can just kind of have as much screen area available to focus on my graphic, because Illustrator's got a lot of palettes. So depending on your screen size, you can feel pretty crowded, and you can also collapse your menus and things. But I mean, I'm assuming that everybody's pretty comfortable working with the Adobe Creative Cloud sort of user interface model, the lockable palettes, the dockable palettes, all those things, tabbing between your palette groups. So you can really customize your workspace quite a bit. And we'll get into how each of those palettes really work. But these are the ones that I'm always working with on no matter what project I have. I've always got my swatches and my color, my transparency and my gradient. And then there is also the appearance panel, which I'll get into in what I call working with color level 2. So that's pretty much it for video 1B of working with color. From here, I think you've pretty much got everything that you need to get started. The next video, which is going to be the level 2, is just going to be adding the use of the appearance panel, and then understanding how filters and things like that react to the way you build your color swatches as well.